I was going to speak about a critical analysis of Pakistan's female labor force participation. But after having been equated to the great Lord Krishna himself yesterday, albeit in jest, I feel that my presentation is going to be a huge, huge disappointment for all of you. But nonetheless, let's proceed and see what the data says. I was going through the report of the Planning Commission of Pakistan, and they very proudly presented the data that that the female participation ratio had doubled from 1992 to 2014. It had jumped from only 13.3% to 25%. This would be a very significant increase in female labor force participation, obviously. And I think we know what feminist theory says about the sexual division of labor, how it is related to forms of marriage, sexuality, conditions of reproduction, and how all of that, of course, is connected to the social and economic foundations of patriarchy itself. There are, of course, many different forms of feminism. I don't have to tell you. And one form in particular, the one that I think is most strongly associated with the left, has situated the sexual division of labor, or the division of labor in general, at the center of the dynamics of society and all the social relations that are created as a consequence. I must submit to you that in my study I was deeply influenced by Esther Bozrok. Her work, although it was originally written in the 1970s, Women's Role in Economic Development, is an eye-opening study with respect to the relationship between the division of labor, the sexual division of labor, the forms of marriage, patriarchy, and so on. In her work, she examines three different forms of agricultural work: hoeing, plough cultivation, and cultivation with systems of irrigation, that is, artificial systems or man-made or human-made systems of irrigation. And in fact, she comes up with a striking conclusion that the more primitive the form of agriculture, the greater the participation of women. For instance, where agriculture was primarily done through hoeing with the hand, it was primarily women that were engaging in agriculture as an occupation. They had the produce of agriculture. They would take it to the markets. And for that reason, their economic participation was incredibly high. And she looks at several major parts of Africa: Tanzania, Mozambique, Madagascar. And interestingly, even today, these are the countries with the highest female labor force participation, reaching up to 80%, because in agriculture, women are at the forefront. But as you move to systems of irrigation, you discover, or she writes, that the economic power is taken away from the woman and is concentrated and focused in the hands of the man. And as a consequence, patriarchal control increases as you go through these different forms of agriculture. It's a phenomenal study. And of course, it was one of the seminal studies that inspired the United Nations to look into this question, and other organizations. Now, whenever one talks about the sexual division of labor, the question obviously arises about economic determinism. And I concede to you that, of course, there are significant other aspects: the role of history, the whole of ideology, religion, politics, culture. All of these create many layers of complexity. And so we don't want to have a very simplistic relationship. I look at Nepal, for example. Whenever I visit Nepal and I compare it to Pakistan, I find that because of the struggles that people in Nepal have been through, the culture, the religion, so many other factors that I'm still discovering, despite the fact that economically they may be in a very different situation from Pakistan, but with respect to gender relations, in my view, they're far, far ahead. They're far, far ahead. But when we think about longer historical time frames, as Eric Olin Wright puts it, then we find that these sorts of explanations about the sexual division of labor begin to make more sense. They begin to really determine how social relations are formed and structured. So we understand then that if women have been restricted in any given society to childcare and household work, then the status of childcare and household work will largely determine the status of women in that society. The same can be said about race relations. If a particular people are restricted to a particular kind of work, then the status of that work will be equivalent more or less, or will determine the status of that particular caste or race or group of people or nation and so on. Now, I want us to really rethink what Pakistan has done with this data, in which we have said that female labor force participation has gone up from 13% to 25%. We know and we can see that, in fact, as far as human development is concerned, overall, Pakistan is placed at 161 out of 192 countries. It is extremely low. And as far as the gender gap is concerned, we are placed at 145 out of 146 countries. We are second from the bottom. We are just above war-torn Afghanistan. And the FLFP rate, sorry, that's a mouthful, what do they say and what do they not say? These are aggregate statistics. And hence, they don't really look at what kind of jobs women are doing. These jobs could be highly insecure, extremely vulnerable. They could have very low wage levels, and the working conditions could be very precarious, and so on. They don't say anything about that at all. Let's start with education. In 2022, the Global Gender Gap Index showed that Pakistan ranked 135th out of 146 countries in educational attainment. More than 53% of females aged between 50 and 64 have never attended school, compared to 33% men. 53% women in Pakistan have never attended school. A third of the men have never attended school. Around 60% of women in the labor force have no formal education. Again, compared to the men, that's about 30%. In rural areas, the primary level net enrollment rate for girls is 56% and for boys is 67%. So we see that there is a discrepancy there. At the secondary level, this rises. The discrepancy rises. It's only 19% for girls, 25% for boys. And the data about not in education, employment or training, NEET rate for young women is strikingly 75%. So 75% of women are not in education, employment or training of any sort. That's stupendous. Half of Pakistani women do not know how to use the internet at all. At all. Only 15% of women actually use the internet. Only 30% of all the women have a mobile phone. So the actual usage of internet by women is about 15%. And I do lots of social media sort of outreach, which is why we also have a camera here. And I can tell you that my audience is 80-90% male. And the reason is mainly not because I haven't tried to reach out to women, but mainly that is the rough proportion of the relationship between male and females that are using social media in Pakistan. In Pakistan, only 6% women have bank accounts. So you can see that that is shocking. That means that the financial inclusion of women is extremely low. Moreover, women are focused in a very narrow range of sectors. Most women that are employed in education, health services and domestic work, cooking, cleaning, childcare, in private houses. Women represent only 9% of the top 1% of earners, but nearly 90% of those in the bottom 1% of wage earners. Nearly 80% of female labor force participation are there basically in agriculture. So when we talk about women's employment, it is now mainly in agriculture. And most of it is, again, informal. Women's informal employment as a percentage of non-agricultural employment, that is outside of agriculture, is 92.1%, according to the ILO. Women make up less than 5% of federal government employees, even though the federal government has a quota of 10%. 10% have to be women, but that quota also is never filled up. And this, by the way, is an AI generated image. It's not really what female employment and the government sector looks like in Pakistan. In the industrial division, women are even smaller. Only 3.62% of employment in all industrial divisions is basically women's employment. Tiny, tiny number. 23% of women have reported physical violence. 26% have reported emotional violence. 5% have reported sexual violence with their husbands and intimate partners. Naturally, reported data is significantly far, far below the actual level of gender violence in the country. So when Pakistani government says, look here, we have achieved 25% female labor force participation, they neglect to add that even at 25%, it is the lowest in the region except for Afghanistan. India, as you pointed out, was at least 31, 32%. Other countries are similar. Sri Lanka, we were told yesterday, despite having an extremely high literacy rate, was also in the 30s. Well, Pakistan, even at 25%, is the lowest in the region. But here is the most shocking data of all. This 25% shift, or the shift to 25%, the increase to 25%, according to the World Bank, is mostly because of, and I quote, unpaid work in rural areas. What does that mean? Firstly, this is not formal employment. They're not being paid for it. So the unpaid work in rural areas is essentially the agricultural work that they have already been doing for generations and generations. And now suddenly, from the 90s till this period, the Pakistani government has decided, well, let's include this in the data regarding female labor force participation ratio. And so it appears as if women are moving out of traditionally the sexual division of labor and moving into all sorts of new avenues, but the reality is very different. The reality is that they're still pretty much doing the same work they've been doing for generations. So this 25% data about female labor force participation ratio, even despite being the fact that it's the lowest in the region, is itself still extremely misleading. And in my view, this kind of data is only cooking the books to look good in international reports and not really examining the actual lived conditions and situation on the ground. So obviously, we have to change this situation, these circumstances. We have to close the gender gap in education as well as in employment. We must move women out of the informal sector and encourage formal employment for men as well as for women, although the vast majority of women are really enrolled or really employed in the informal sector. We obviously have to have gender-sensitive workplace policies. We have to involve women more in those kinds of jobs that are considered to be high technology jobs and high status jobs, whether that's IT, not necessarily like the gig economy, but formal IT jobs, finance, management, STEM sciences. These are the kinds of things that Pakistan needs to really think about and focus on if we are going to really make a serious dent in the gendered division of labor. Thank you so much. Does it elevate the status of women to acknowledge the work that women are doing? In a very limited sense. It is important to understand that women have been doing unpaid labor for generations, whether in the household or in agriculture, and that forms a vital part of the overall work done in society that keeps everything moving, keeps the wheels of society moving. But I want to emphasize that what is the goal that someone like myself and all of the panelists here and others are aspiring towards? I think it would be the end of patriarchy itself. And in relation to that, it's a very minimal, small step, let's say, to acknowledge the role of women is important. But how does it change the lived experiences of women? Not by a whole lot. It may, I think, in my view, Um, it may, of course, it has an impact on the way we write our reports and the way we put together our data and so on. But what really is that data used for at the end of the day? When I see these kinds of reports, the one that I read, it said, oh, we've increased women's female labor force participation from 13% to 25%, and Vision 2025 is saying that we're going to increase it to 40% by XYZ year. Now, this is, and then they put that forward to, European donors and other people and say, look, we're making such great progress. And I just, so when the purpose of this entire methodology is just, is very, very cynical. And for that reason, I would like us to understand that if by increasing female labor force participation, we are under the misapprehension that the sexual division of labor is somehow breaking up or being challenged or changing, that is simply not true. That's my submission.